Welcome to all of you to this celebration of the life of the legendary University of Rochester leader, Robert Joynt. I'm honored to have helped plan this program, working with Margaret, University and Medical Center Neurology Department leadership. The real challenge was to pick people when literally hundreds of people each had their own unique Bob Joynt stories and unique perspective on him as a wonderful person. Bob was proud of his Iowa roots. He often remarked, "I was born in Iowa, in a manger." The Irish love a party, and Bob was proud of his Irish roots. At a party at our house less than 6 months ago, Bob observed, "If an Irishman says he enjoyed the party, he wasn't there." But there was more to Bob than one-liners, as we'll share this afternoon. First, Ann Joynt for the family.
Good afternoon. A glimpse into a perfect day for our dad, when not amongst his many colleagues, students, and friends here at the University of Rochester, would be with his family. Though he traveled and sailed worldwide, he loved also to be at home. His day would begin early with the online New York Times crossword puzzle, completed in record time. I would just be getting up when he was pleased to announce, "I think you will find today's puzzle was completed in 23 minutes. Off he'd go, hand-delivering coffee and the morning paper to the lifelong apple of his eye, our mom, he affectionately referred to as Punk. Invariably, his uniform for the day was the ubiquitous white short-sleeved shirt and khaki pants. He loved a breakfast composed of such food groups that were of questionable health benefits, such as the gastronomic mess of kippers, scrapple, or chipped beef on toast, which he learned to love in his days in the Army. My father also loved spending time at his lake home. As everyone knows, my father had a voracious appetite for the written word. It was here that he could settle into all things literary. When his eyesight began to diminish, it was the first iteration of the iPod that allowed him to enjoy all the histories and mysteries he so loved, from further educating himself on the strokes of the 28th President of the United States or relishing in the cunning exploits of Mr. Sherlock Holmes. As Kenneth Grahame said, there is nothing, absolutely nothing, half so much worth doing as simply messing about in boats. Dad owned the same sailboat for over 40 years. It just started taking on water this summer, maybe knowing its owner is not attending to it as expertly as in years past. The solitary trip down the lake in his kayak was one of his most favorite times of the day. He loved the wind and the water and was most happy at the tiller or on the golf course greens with his sons. A lunch of a chili dog and a shake, and an afternoon playing Scrabble with his daughters. He'd come up with an obscure word like DHOW, and when challenged, he would say, "A dhow? Well, that's an Arabian sailing vessel, of course." After we consulted the dictionary, he was, in fact, always correct. And the reminder of his Scrabble victory, not unlike his triumphant crossword completion that morning, would be announced periodically throughout the remainder of the day. Sometimes the afternoon included reruns of Seinfeld or MASH or Cash Cab. He also loved to watch sports, a current golf tournament or the football of his beloved Hawkeyes, while enjoying a very dry Mary Teeny, so nicknamed as my sister Mary made just the right melange of spirits, ice, and olives. Nowhere happier was he than at the head of the table, across from our mom, asking what words we had learned that day and telling excellent stories and jokes over a grand meal shared, as he liked to say, with his 6 children sired, 5 acquired, and his 9 grandchildren, who all know him and knew him as Babu. And for those that don't know, he was not fond of green vegetables, sad movies, the Dallas Cowboys, idle gossip, or the end of summer. He relished the time with his children and his grandchildren. He loved his books, his good friends, his work, being Irish, every kind, shape, and origin of oyster now known or ever to be invented. He loved grappa, linguine with clam sauce. He loved the song Edelweiss and Danny Boy, anything and anyone from the state of Iowa, including his beloved mom and dad and his wonderful sisters. And more than anyone, the woman, our mom. The two of them were the true founders of the Deep and Loving and Mutual Admiration Society. He marveled at the night sky, the infinite stars and galaxies, and he knew the names of all the constellations. He'd retire for the evening, when drowsy, to don his unique and well-worn pair of pajamas named the Frowsies, always with a good book in mind or in hand. How did such a man of such small stature leave such a large imprint on so many people? I guess simply because he made our lives and all of our lives so fun. When we were children in the evening, to make going to bed an adventure, he concocted a silly changing game and stories of a fictional boy character with humorous exploits named Willie McKeever, and he'd lead us happily up to bed with a chant of his own making, boom-de-boom-de-biddly-boom, and as adults with sage advice such as NBD, an acronym meaning no big deal, that taught us not to get upset over things in life that money could fix, to not sweat the small stuff, and that the real sorrow could be reserved for the times a higher power would take over. He was interesting, he was interested, he was intuitive and imaginative, he was devoted, reliable, humble, and caring, but most of all, he was so very kind, and all of us witnessed that. So to borrow some inspiration from the memorial to the first victim of 9/11, a kindred Irishman, we say goodbye to the man who was our dad and our friend, but not to his buoyant spirit. We say goodbye to the strong hands, but not their healing ways. We say goodbye to the eyes, but not their keen insight. And goodbye to the enormous and beautiful heart, but not the love he had for all of us. Never to the love. Thank you all for the love and support you have showed to him and to us, his family. To all of the nurses and the doctors who tended to his illness and his final illnesses. To all the medical students, past and present, who will carry on his creative way of teaching. To his very devoted assistant, Nancy. To the wise and supportive administrators and staff, to his friends, assistants, researchers and colleagues in the Department of Neurology and the Medical Center, to the chaplains and the nuns for all of their prayers. Thank you for being his other family here at his other home, the University of Rochester. Good afternoon. A few weeks after my dad died, I was at my parents' house on Sandpiper Lane and wandered into his closet in their first floor bedroom. His familiar short-sleeve white shirts sagged a bit on their wooden hangers. The shoes, sandals, slippers he had worn were lined up on the closet floor below them, and a shelf with some neckties, mostly gifts, reflected events, places, and holidays. And he had so many coats, most of them polar fleece. We had probably bought him 15 in his later life, hoping to keep him warm from the elements, or just trying desperately to provide him comfort and coziness, no matter how slight, during his many recent illnesses. My mother wanted me to take one of the coats that day, but I held it up in front of me and looked at it, but left it there on his bed. This is because I've come to realize, since the death of my father, that I have the best coat and the only coat I will ever need. The coat my parents started to create from the moment I and each of my siblings were born. I've worn it all the time. This coat has provided me more than the slightest comfort in the wake of this grief. Ever present, it truly envelops me. I would like to think that it is made of Irish wool, very thin, perhaps even a bit ill-fitting through overuse. Its fabric is rich, with family laughter and chaotic conversation, and memories of sitting around the table on Christmas Eve or on an August summer night at the cottage. It is also imperfect, stained with life and living, the strain of illness, the concern only a parent can feel for a child, and later the worry that a child has for a parent. My pockets are full of the lovely times that I had the privilege of sharing just alone with my dad. Walking on the lake road just a half a mile to the camp and turning back, as he would say, reciting Yeats' The Lake Islet and It's Free Together, playing Scrabble, or should I say being beat at Scrabble repeatedly, discussing his next neurology column and reveling in the fascination of words. We enjoyed a happy hour drink or two. My pockets spill over with this joy, silliness, and laughter, so pure, so palpable. It trails around me and makes me smile. It does. The thread that moves through my coat reminds me to be humble. It enables me to see only the good that shines from people and prods me to mother my children as I was guided, to make the right decisions at every turn and to connect with others and love each uniquely, brilliantly, and unconditionally. How can your children thank you, Dad, for all of these wonderful gifts? I can only try to honor you by wearing this coat with my arms outstretched. I will welcome the joys that are before me, and I will weather any pains yet to come. I am buttoned up with all of the heart and humanity that you had mastered, but for which I still strive. How can we thank you, Mom? I will tell you this now. Thank you, Margaret Joynt, because from the minute you delivered each of us onto this earth, not only did you create and mend this coat along the way, you mothered and continue to mother us in a most extraordinary fashion. My father wore another coat in addition to his 30 polar fleece coats. That was his white coat. You can see pictures of him inside the program wearing his beloved white coat. He loved it and all it symbolized: physician, caregiver, teacher, and mentor. Finally, I would like to note that even though my father held lofty positions at the university, his intentions were always simply grounded. He knew that the success of this university in a sustained way really meant the happiness of those living within it. To him, this university was not a place made of brick and mortar and budgets, but it was truly built by all of you, bright, caring, dedicated, and diverse individuals. Thank you, each of you. Unbelievably and believably, his love of family, love of his wife, love of his many friends, and love of this university truly transcends his death, and we celebrate this love today. Thank you.
My heart is aching as you go away. Oh, Danny boy, the pipes are calling from glen to glen and down the mountainside. The summer's gone and all the roses falling. It's you must go and I must bide. But come ye back when summer's in the meadow, or when the valley's hushed and white with snow. It's I'll be here in sunshine or in shadow. Oh, Danny boy, I love you so. But come ye back when summer's in the meadow, or when the valley's hushed and white with snow. Remember, I'll be here in sunshine or in shadow. Oh, Danny boy, I love you so, I love
We celebrate today the life of a good man who was also a great man. His greatness, in part, can be measured by those who join us. Margaret Joynt leads a contingent of, we're not entirely clear, but at least 20 Joynts who have joined us today, and some will be with us tomorrow. I'm honored that Bob Whitmer, the Chair Emeritus of our board, is here, that Dennis O'Brien, our former university president, has joined us, that Mac Everts, our former Chief Executive Officer of the Medical Center, is here, Mark Taubman, our current Dean of the School of Medicine and Dentistry, members of our board, Tom Wilmot, and former member Ron Knight, and so many others. And you've come here, I suspect, as I did, not merely because of the achievements of Bob Joynt, but because of the extraordinary character. This was a man, if I may paraphrase Nietzsche, who learned early in life that ye who aspire to greatness learn how to laugh. He was a leader with a gentle touch. He was someone who inspired people to work together. And he built so much, so graciously. It takes the sands of time to fully appreciate the magnitude of his achievements. Bob was here when we created the current structure of the medical center. The challenge you have in any medical center which owns hospitals and a school of medicine, and as ours does just for fun, a school of nursing, an Eastman Institute of Oral Health, and a few other little things, is coordination. And Bob, working with Paul Greiner, was able to consolidate the two under a senior leader called the Chief Executive Officer, and to find the right balance between clinical care and education and research. My own study of healthcare systems in the country suggests how rare a balance as effective as the one we have at the University of Rochester is. And Bob achieved this not ever with a raised voice, not ever with a threat, not ever with the slightest moment of pain, but with patience, good grace, and wisdom. It is an achievement that has lasted now for decades, and no doubt will be the structure of our medical center for decades to come. What is striking, though, is how much else his life bears testimony to. Before he began his remarkable career in academic administration as Dean of the Medical School in 1985, Bob created our Department of Neurology. It's one of the nation's leading departments. He was a great scholar in that field. And it was an achievement, again, that will endure through the decades. Literally, when the Medical Center contemplated its 2007-2008 strategic plan, neuroscience was one of the key areas they focused on and continue to focus on as we're now in a new iteration of strategic planning. He was an individual who served as Vice President for Health Affairs and Vice Provost between 1985 and 1994. And these were challenging years for the medical center. To a significant degree, the vicissitudes of Medicaid, Medicare, third-party payers, National Institutes of Health Finance seem to guarantee that leadership of academic health centers is an endless roller coaster ride. Bob helped us, if you'll forgive now a horribly mixed metaphor, to navigate the rapids in that period, to build the basis, again, of great achievements that we experienced neither then but subsequently. In 1997, he was recognized as a distinguished university professor. To be the holder of a professorship, an endowed professorship like this, is a high honor, but there's none higher at our university than the distinguished university professor. It goes to a remarkably small number of individuals who've made an impact not only in their field, as Bob unquestionably did, but throughout the entire university. His life, then, is a tribute to a man who, in some sense, achieved all any of us could aspire to achieve. He was a wonderful husband, blessed with an extraordinary family. He was the most marvelous colleague, as others will address today, a distinguished scientist, an academic leader who built, an academic leader whose achievements not only were in his own time, but have continued for decades afterwards. I met him only in the last few years of his life, and he was an individual who perhaps, as is not uncommon for the Irish, who had a twinkle in his eye, often an amusing story, but also a dignity and grace about him that was incredibly rare. I will miss Bob Joynt. He was an individual who truly left his mark on our university. But I am pleased that today, in honoring him, the ceremony begins with family, and then we'll recognize the many dimensions of this extraordinary man. Bob, as I suggested, was a good man who was also a great man. And I know I speak for all of us that we are the stronger for having had the opportunity to have shared his time on this earth.
Well, it is true that faculty involved in a presidential search are curious about the potential candidate. The candidate is equally curious about those learned folks sitting in judgment on his or her future employment. Because I grew up in a medical family, my father was chair of the Department of Medicine at Loyola University in Chicago. I was particularly interested in the medical member of the search committee. When I was growing up, I heard many dinner party conversations, we only seemed to entertain doctors, going over the cantankerous politics and touchy egos of the medical school. I suppose I had a premonition at that time of what Jules Cohen later told me was the ancient Chinese curse, "May you become the president of 2 medical schools." If I were to be selected as president, how would I deal with this delicate territory? My clue would have to be Robert Joynt, M.D., the representative of the medical school on the search committee. I asked around, and I can't remember who summed up Robert Joynt, but the message was, if you could select any person from the whole country to be a justice of the Supreme Court, it would be Bob Joynt. That first message emerged in my mind when I thought, what would I say about Bob on this occasion? Supreme Court. Now, there's a famous anecdote that when the great Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes first met the new president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, he commented, "A second-class intellect, but a first-class temperament." Well, I knew nothing at that time about Robert Joynt, the first-class intellect. It took time to learn about his distinguished academic career, his leading position in the field of neurology, his broad interests fueled by omnivorous reading. But you only had to meet Bob once to know you were dealing with something more precious than intellect. You were dealing with a first-class temperament. This university, this medical school, has lots of first-class intellects. But anyone who has spent even a half an hour at a faculty meeting anywhere across campus may long for more first-class temperament. So if you are looking for a dean to direct and soothe all those first-class intellects, you definitely want a first-class temperament. Picking Bob Joynt as dean of the medical school was, therefore, one of the easiest and most obvious right decisions of my time as president. A clear mark of Bob's first-class temperament was his sense of humor. Bob could not start a lecture without a cry from the class, "Joke, joke, joke." When he was newly appointed as dean, Bob held his first meeting with the departmental chairs. He went to the anatomy department and borrowed a full-length skeleton. He placed it in front of the meeting and announced to his assembled colleagues, "The budget is bare bones." It's not enough to note that Bob had a sense of humor. Humor has many forms. There are jokesters who can't wait to make a splash with their latest guffaw. There's raucous humor, dark humor, cynical humor. Bob's sense of humor was wise humor, the sort of humor that soothes anxiety by placing high intellect and tough budgets into a longer story, a different story about the day after disaster. Margaret tells me that Bob would deal with homey crisis by saying NBD, no big deal. For Bob, there was always a longer story, a tomorrow beyond. Humor and first-class temperament were linked and deeply rooted in Bob's life. Bob Joynt was probably the closest friend I had at Rochester, and it was no hindrance to our friendship that we were both Irish and Catholic. Strange as it may seem, beyond all the troubles of Irish history and the even greater troubles of Catholic history, there exists in their narrative a final sense of no NBD, no big deal, because however grim the day, life is a long story of belief and hope. Bob lived belief, he knew hope. That's what makes a first-class temperament.
So roughly 10 years ago, I was sitting in my office in New York trying to decide whether I was going to once again leave New York and the beloved Metropolitan Opera to come to Rochester. And as I was making this decision, I started to get emails giving me advice. I got two types of advice. The first was, you've got to check out Wegmans, to which I usually responded, I'm not making the decision based upon the supermarket. And the second one is, the University of Rochester Medical Center is a wonderful place to work. And I think that one of the reasons that it is a wonderful place to work is very much due to the legacy that was Bob Joynt. And I'll talk about four things. One is collegiality, the second is mentorship, the third is curiosity, and the fourth is vision. A hallmark of our medical center is its collegial nature. It's a trait that sets us apart from many academic medical centers. And that collegial nature was very much, as you just heard, the fabric of Bob Joynt. And he very much led by example. He came from a generation that we now refer to as either the Iron Men or the grand old men of medicine. It was a time when a department chair was first and foremost intimidating. I can tell you I spent a lot of time as a resident, as a fellow, as a junior faculty, in abject fear of my department chair, although we ultimately became great friends. And I think what was so unique about Bob at that time was that he understood that this is not the best way to lead, and that he really went out of his way to not be the intimidating department chair. Of course, when you're that bright, you tend to be intimidating even if you don't want to be. But what was very clear is that he had an open office, that he encouraged his students, he encouraged young residents and fellows, he encouraged young faculty. At grand rounds, like all of his peers, he would sit in the first row. Usually that was so you could look around and see who didn't come, so you could then make them aware that you knew they hadn't come and that they better come. I think in Bob's case, it was to set a tone. And that tone was one where there was humor, where every speaker who came felt comfortable, not under the gun, where people felt comfortable to ask questions, but to laugh. And it was quite insightful, but it was fun. Right? He also was a phenomenal teacher, perennially a top choice for the medical students doing their training in neurology. What I have learned as I go around the country talking to alumni, what they like to talk about is not so much the research or the general accomplishments of the university, but people. And I always got the same questions. Always 3 or 4 people that got mentioned every time. How's Bob Joynt? How's he doing? He was such a wonderful teacher. And it's very clear, the more I go around, the more it was clear that Bob Joynt affected everybody. That he was on everybody's mind, whether the person was in neurology, was in medicine. He was known as a great teacher. His teaching, of course, didn't just extend to students and fellows. I think he always viewed himself as a teacher. He was the editor of the Archives of Neurology. He founded the seminars in neurology. He was the author of the major textbook, Baker and Joynt's Clinical Neurology. All aspects of being a teacher. And I think as Cy Schwartz will talk about, that extended to being a member of the Pundits Club, which is, if nothing else, a way of teaching people about things far afield from what you do in your career. And I think perhaps the greatest tribute to this was not only was he elected to the Institute of Medicine, but he mentored Dr. Birch Grigg, who was subsequently elected to the Institute, and they both mentored Ira Schultzen, who was also elected to the Institute. So it is teaching, it is mentorship, it is something that we value so much at the University of Rochester, and what very much makes us special. He also was a builder and a visionary. He really was the prime mover in the development of the Department of Neurology. From a beginning with just 3 neurologists, the department now has 25 times larger, is regarded as one of the top departments in the nation, both as a research department and as a clinical department, and it is still regarded as the best department in teaching. And even today, that legacy extends to its current faculty. Among his recruits were Birch Griggs and Ira Schultzen and Dick Moxley. His reach in neurology extended far beyond Rochester. He served as president of both top neurology organizations, the American Academy of Neurology and the American Neurological Association. As you heard from Joel Seligman, as dean and vice president, he joined forces with Paul Greiner to establish the administrative structure that has served the URMC so well as it has grown its research, educational, and clinical missions. He recruited key people who, like him, shaped the institution and their departments. These include Barbara Igluski, the former chair of microbiology, Robert Heckelman, the former chair of pediatrics, Cy Schwartz, former chair of surgery, Dick Burton, chair of orthopedics. All of these people, not only great clinicians, but also people who valued the teaching, who valued the concept of being Renaissance person, and very much has created this fabric which made it easy for people to say, if you come to the University of Rochester Medical Center, you're going to enjoy yourself. In summary, Dr. Joynt was an extraordinary talented individual, a wonderful person, a great leader who has left a legacy that will help ensure that the medical center can carry out the motto of this great university, ever better.
I was given the charge of considering Bob Joynt as a fellow member of the Pundit Club, and I'd point out there are several members in attendance on this occasion. It immediately brought to mind a conversation that Bob and I had at one of the meetings trying to define the origin of the idiom, mind your P's and Q's. I, with great certainty, indicated that it stemmed from the early letterpress, when the printers placed individual letters in reverse fashion on a template, and there was confusion between the lowercase p and the lowercase q. Bob loudly exclaimed, "That's all wrong." This stemmed from the 17th century Irish pub, in which you had to keep an eye on whether pints or quarts were being consumed. So what I propose to do is to mind my own P's and Q's, and I'd ask the question, what more could one individual give to another human being than 4 P's? They are prestige, purse, physical well-being, and pleasure. Bob Joynt contributed to my life in each and every one of those elements. In the realm of prestige and purse, it was Bob, as the dean of this medical school, who appointed me as chair of the Department of Surgery, thus providing an element of prestige and somewhat slightly enhancing my purse. But it was during my tenure as chair that I had the occasion to host a formal black-tie dinner for over 100 chairs of surgery from around the country and some from Europe, and I had asked Bob to give the after-dinner speech. It is the only occasion when I watch such a group assiduously taking notes during the speech of an after-dinner speaker. And I remember the memorable statement on that occasion, and I quote Bob. He told them, "All that is required of a dean is unequivocal honesty and integrity, and the ability to fake them." It was in the area of my own personal well-being that the extraordinary neurologist diagnostician was Bob, who diagnosed my Bell's palsy, and not only arranged for my continued care, but with constant humanistic concern followed my course. But Bob's diagnostic acumen really spanned other fields, and it reminds me of the story of Bob's relationship with Erwin Frank, a professor of urology. Each year, they would have a member golf tournament at the Irondequoit Country Club and the Country Club of Rochester. They played first at the Irondequoit Country Club, where they performed extremely well, and then on the occasion of the tournament at the Country Club of Rochester, Erwin performed miserably. Then Bob, the diagnostician, came to the fore and pointed out to Erwin Frank that at the Irondequoit Country Club, the greens were read from right to left like Hebraic text, whereas at the Country Club of Rochester, it was in the ordinary fashion. But it was the 4th P, the affordance of personal pleasure, that most of us will remember Bob for. Whether it was his wry humor at a casual luncheon of cronies in the cafeteria, or the occasion of a formal convocation in which he followed President O'Brien's description of what he had done during the past summer, in which he had worked on a significant philosophic opus. After President O'Brien spoke, Bob got up and exclaimed briefly,
I had a miserable summer during which a root canal was performed. My most pleasurable associations with Bob took place at the Pundit Club. It's a group of 24 Rochesterians who are obliged to present a formal paper biannually. Bob's presentations often coincided with a St. Patrick's Day corned beef and cabbage dinner which Margaret and his daughters prepared for us. His last two talks were extraordinary. Over the years, Bob had a diversity in panoramic presentations going from the presidential illnesses to the origin of the gestures we make every day. But his last two talks were memorable in that they were given flawlessly without any regard to his written text, because he was having visual problems at the time. So let me move from my P's to my Q's and indicate that I consider my brief presentation to be a minuscule quid for the major quos that Bob personally has presented me with during the life. Now, I've had an extraordinary experience. Throughout my academic life, there are two people with whom I've closely related for over a half century who have come from the improbable location of Lamar, Iowa. Population 9,870 according to the 2010 census. One was Bob Joynt, and the other was Tom Starzl, the father of liver transplantation. They were high school classmates, graduated the same year, and played defensive back on the same football team. Now, Bob told me they were noted and called the touchdown twins. Why? Because whenever the opposition running back or receiver of a pass reached their area, they invariably passed them and went on to score a touchdown. Now, this is typical of Bob's self-effacement, one of the great endearments that will continue, and I return to P, who ensure his persistence and permanence in our minds and hearts.
I can speak for many in this room by saying that few individuals have impacted my professional and personal life as much as Bob Joynt did. To me, he represented a mentor and leader who was concerned about the complete you. He always said, "Family comes first," a phrase I use to this day with my students and residents, and even with my colleagues. I wish to share a vignette about Bob that typifies his relationship to his trainees. When I was a fourth-year medical student at the U of R, I took a brief seminar elective on higher cortical functions with Dr. Joynt. As a student, I didn't think he knew me very well. At the time, I was struggling to decide on neurology or an internal medicine as a career path. I tentatively decided on internal medicine and went off to Boston for my training. But within a few months, I concluded that neurology was a better fit. I telephoned Dr. Joynt, who fortunately remembered me, and told him of my decision. I said I would be most interested in returning to Strong for my residency and asked him how I should go about applying and interviewing for a position. He said that I had just completed the interview process. And he would get back to me in a few days after speaking with some of the other faculty. Several days later, he called me and offered me a residency position. That was it. No high-stress interviews, no essays, no apprehensive waiting. And he changed my life and that of my family forever. The environment he created for residents was one of clinical excellence, constant learning, camaraderie, and humanism. His knowledge of neurology and neuroscience was remarkable, and his ability to engage both patients and residents with his humility and humor are legendary. I remember trying to stay awake after on-call nights and having to control my sleep-deprived giggles as I attended his rounds. I recall Dr. Joynt walking down the hall towards 51600 as Jack Rosance and I sat in the chief resident office at the end of the hallway and watched in amazement as Bob launched that small football-sized doctor bag of his into the air while telling us to get ready for the football season. And I was so impressed when I attended a post-residency reunion at the Joynt's home with my family. Here was this world-renowned figure kneeling down to be at eye level with my daughters and telling them to just call me Bob. So how does one measure the success of a department? I know that some in this room will count patient visits and clinical dollars, and others will sum NIH research funds. But I will offer you another measure. In 1980, the department began to have a reunion at the annual meeting of the American Academy of Neurology. There were a few attendees at that first meeting. Now there are dozens, spanning several generations of faculty and trainees and representing every region of the country and many international locales. There are annual faculty and alumni awards and a bit of fundraising. But most importantly, there are hugs and catching up, remembrances and storytelling. And it all goes back to Bob and his vision. I submit to you that this might be the most meaningful metric of them all. Please allow me a few words directly to Margaret and the family. As you may know, several months ago I stood in front of my family, friends, and colleagues and eulogized my wife of 37 years, whom parenthetically I met a few hundred yards from here 40 years ago. The love and support that I and my family have received has, I trust, been mirrored in your family. I know only too well that hearing others share their fond remembrances of a loved one can be most comforting. Please know that the dear memories of Bob go beyond your immediate circle of family and friends and extend to Bob's enormous family of students and residents. We will honor his memory by emulating his values and ideals in our lives and will pass them on to future generations. It is our privilege to have been touched by Bob and our responsibility to propagate Joyntisms to our mentees.
I'm honored to say a few words as student, resident, and faculty. I think on behalf of all the many students, residents, and faculty members that Bob Joynt touched in his tenure. And I also want to disclose that I'm going to read from a in memoriam that I prepared for Archives of Neurology, soon to be dubbed JAMA Neurology, and so I'm not indicted for auto-plagiarism, as he would often point out to me. But I think the most striking thing about Bob Joynt was his generativity, and this was empowered by humility and wit. Now, generativity is an interesting concept that came to me actually in college. It was coined by the psychologist Erik Erikson, who described the various stages of life, and this was the really paramount stage in life that one reached, and always was looking for somebody who really emulated that. And Erikson said it's a point of a powerful trait that's cultivated and naturally shared throughout life. And it was his nature was to nurture. And he possessed a deep concern for guiding the next generation, for giving back as he received, and moving beyond self and family to the concern and care of patients, students, colleagues, friends, community, and humanity. He was very sympathetic to the needy, and he embraced the mantra, to each his or her farthest star. His generativity was profuse and palpable, and whether in his physical presence or in the large, kind-hearted shadow that he cast. He certainly honed self-effacement to a high art, and he was gracious and thankful of genuine praise, but he cautiously restrained ego and had a finely balanced sense of self. He wore his vast knowledge lightly, and his humility was authentic and omnipresent, and this unassuming nature disarmed the arrogant. He avoided fanfare. Humility and humor were interchangeable currencies of the Joynt persona that exuded integrity and ease. His humor, of course, was an essential element of engagement that helped develop relationships and forge compromise. Vital attributes for a department chair or a dean or whatever leadership position he was in. As a movement disorder neurologist, I was always struck with the fact that few are born and die with a twinkle in the eye, the oculofacial sparkle that Joynt enjoyed. And this twinkle enhanced his jokes. His wit was quick, it was clean, it was thought-provoking, and his delivery was smooth and captivating. In my memoriam, I put together my 10 top Joyntisms, and I'll leave you to read that when it's published. But I just want to mention two. One, my wife Josie's favorite, which is, the only thing harder than being a saint is living with one. And my favorite is, you can't always be right, but you can always be kind. And there's no limit to kindness. And for all his accomplishments and his ability and wisdom, Bob Joynt stayed conspicuously modest and remarkably kind, a person the Irish call salt of the earth, and many others call a real mensch, a good, kind, decent, and honorable human being.
There are many great things about Rochester, but Bob Joynt is the main reason I stayed and spent my entire career here. He mentored me as his resident, then as his faculty member, and then appointed me as chair of the department. And when he returned to the department, he paid me the tremendous honor by saying he was my faculty member. Each of us could ask Bob Joynt for advice. If one couldn't get in to see Bob to ask him firsthand, we always made decisions based on what we thought Bob would do. And speaking of his traveling, that's just about the only thing the faculty ever questioned. Why was he away so often? You've heard the answer. It's obvious. He was president of every major neurological society. He was honored at lectureships at every major medical center, and he held many national editorial and advisory committee positions. But despite that, any medical student, resident, or faculty member could see him if they wanted to, when he was chair, when he was dean, and even when he was CEO. Bob regularly had lunch with his office staff. He even made small bets on ball games with the housekeeping staff. He wielded humor like a weapon, such as the time he melted the tension of an NIH site visit for our Alzheimer's disease center, ostentatiously handing out a $1 bill to each of the site visitors as the meeting was about to begin. Bob and Margaret had the entire department, faculty and staff, to parties at their house. All their kids helped. It never seemed like work for them, just fun, fellowship, and a good time. Although Bob's eyes twinkled like an Irish leprechaun, he had enough Polish sympathies to dance a wicked polka in the basement of their Pittsford house. Bob's growing neurology department eventually took the place of solo neurologist, the venerable Paul Garvey, Irish from his flaming red hair to the tips of his toes. After Bob plied Paul with enough fluid, Bob would join him in singing, "Climb, climb up Sunshine Mountain." Bob loved people, and he and Margaret almost never missed a party. And on the rare occasions if Bob couldn't get there, Margaret went. She always made it clear that Bob was there in spirit. Despite his international superstardom, Bob's family was, as you've heard, his top priority, and he mentored us, all of us, to make our own families top priority. He also spent time getting to know our families. Once he came to our home to see me. Our 4-year-old daughter, Jennifer, went to the door. Jennifer announced him with, "I don't know who he is, but he's the one who can wiggle his ears." Bob never complained. He's always seemed to be able to find something good to be praised or a spark of interest to be fanned into a blaze of success. I found his reaction to his own health challenges truly inspiring. After his acute respiratory distress syndrome and his critical illness myopathy, he met the challenge of 3 years of rehabilitation with determination, optimism, and a never-give-up attitude, heading for the stairs as subtly as possible to avoid shaming the residents waiting for the elevators. Bob's honesty was 100%. The only time he ever told me something that proved later to be untrue was when he was dean and appointed me chair. He said, "I've always tried to give you everything you asked for, but now I won't be able to do that." In fact, he did continue to give me what I asked for. And he would always say, "The Lord will provide." And if the Lord didn't, Bob did, even to the point of occasionally writing a personal check. In fact, Bob Joynt had something important to do with virtually every success in my career. He never pointed this out to me, but I knew it and was well aware of it, but he never would make anything of this, and I think everyone that worked for him shared this experience. He supported us, made nothing of it, but we knew. When Bob became dean, the department really worried that this would change things. Not long after, Bob and I entered the men's room at the same time. Standing side by side, Bob remarked, "Since I've become dean, this is the only time I'm certain I know what I'm doing." I realized then that the department didn't need to worry. One of the joys of working with Bob is that now when I travel, his friends around the world will invariably regale me with a personal story about their special relationship with Bob Joynt. In a few moments, we'll be adjourning to the Simon School Rotunda with an opportunity to continue to celebrate and enjoy his enormous importance and special meaning to each of us.
May the road rise to meet you. May the wind be always at your back. May the sun shine warm upon your face. May the rain fall soft upon your fields. And until we meet again, may He hold you in His hand. May God upon